Imagine this. You walk into a courthouse, determined to deliver justice, only to be stopped at the door and accused of being a suspect in the very system you've spent your life fighting to fix. This is the reality Judge Carmen Banks faces. A moment of profound irony, an unexpected confrontation. On the same day she's set to preside over a case of racial profiling that could shake the very foundations of law enforcement, she is thrust into a situation that forces her to confront the biases she's worked tirelessly to eradicate. What happens next? It's more than just one officer's prejudice. It's a stark reminder of the insidious threads of a broken system that ensnares so many, a reminder that no one is immune. But before we dive into this gripping tale, tell us in the comments, where are you tuning in from? And don't forget to subscribe to stay with us as we unpack this powerful journey. Judge Carmen Banks was already late. The rhythmic echo of her heels on the concrete parking lot seemed to scream in the oppressive Louisiana heat. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as her mind raced. It was one of those muggy southern mornings when every breath feels like an effort. But today, that weight was compounded by something even heavier: the significance of the trial she was about to face. This wasn't just another day. No, today was different. Today, she was presiding over a case that could make headlines. It could rattle the very core of the justice system in Baton Rouge. As she approached the courthouse, the familiar building felt different, more like a battleground than a place of law. She glanced at her reflection in the glass. Tall, poised, the seasoned judge stared back at her. Yet inside a storm of anxiety brewed. She whispered under her breath, "Focus." There was no room for hesitation, not today. She couldn't afford it. The case at hand was serious. Terrence Daniels, a young man arrested under suspicious circumstances right outside his own apartment complex. The officers involved claimed he matched the description. Those words. Carmen knew them all too well. The hollow justification for actions steeped in bias. She had heard that phrase too many times, and every time, it struck a painful chord. Today, it was her job to ensure that justice wasn't just a concept, it was a reality. But as she rushed toward the side entrance, a new wave of pressure hit her. The media circus outside, the cameras, the flashing lights, it was all too much. She checked the time. Only 10 minutes until the trial began. Her pulse quickened as she tried to sidestep the reporters gathering at the main entrance. She reached for her ID badge, a simple gesture she had done 1,000 times before. But before she could even display it, a voice stopped her cold. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification." Carmen looked up, locking eyes with a young police officer standing in her way. He was in his mid-20s, white, and his gaze felt like it was sizing her up. No, not sizing her up. Judging her. A surge of warning bells rang in Carmen's mind. It wasn't the first time she had felt that look. A mix of suspicion and something darker that she couldn't quite put into words. She was used to it, but that didn't mean it was any less painful. "I'm Judge Banks," she replied, holding up her badge. The officer didn't even look at it. Instead, he scrutinized her, as if she were a criminal caught red-handed. "There's been an incident nearby," he said, his hand hovering dangerously close to his belt. "You match the description of someone we're looking for." Carmen's breath caught. Disbelief swept through her. She was standing at the very courthouse where she had worked for years, and this officer couldn't even be bothered to look at her badge? His words hit her like a punch to the gut. "You matched the description." The same tired excuse she had heard too many times. Her heart raced, but she kept her face calm. Reacting emotionally would only escalate things. "I'm here for a trial," she said, her voice steady. "And I'm already late." But Officer Taylor wasn't backing down. He didn't even flinch as he hovered near his belt. "Doesn't matter who you say you are," he said. "You'll have to answer a few questions before I let you through." Carmen's patience thinned. There was no time for this. She had spent her whole life fighting for justice, and here she was on the other side of it. The irony was thick in the air. Before she could respond, another voice broke the tension. "What's going on here?" Both Carmen and Officer Taylor turned to see an older black officer approaching. His face was lined with experience, and there was a glint of disbelief in his eyes as he recognized Carmen. "Judge Banks?" he asked, his voice a mix of concern and surprise. "Yes," Carmen replied, relief flooding her chest. I'm just trying to get inside. The older officer turned to Officer Taylor, shooting him a look that made Carmen's stomach unclench. Stand down, he commanded. She's the judge for the Daniels case. The tension in the air evaporated slightly as Taylor reluctantly backed down, muttering something under his breath. Carmen nodded at the older officer, grateful for the familiar face, before walking past them into the courthouse. The sterile walls of the courthouse greeted her, but they didn't offer the comfort they once had. Today they felt cold, almost suffocating. The exchange outside had shaken her more than she cared to admit. She had fought battles like this all her life, but the weight of it was starting to settle in deeper than ever before. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Reporters filled the back, pens poised, and the jury sat expectant. Terrence Daniels, the young man at the center of it all, sat at the defense table. His face was a mask of exhaustion, his eyes hollow with defeat. Carmen took her seat at the bench, her gavel heavy in her hand. The trial was about to begin, but her mind kept wandering back to the encounter outside. It wasn't the first time she'd been judged, not by her qualifications, but by the color of her skin. And it wouldn't be the last. But today it wasn't about her. It was about Terrence Daniels, about the countless people like him who had been wrongly accused, humiliated, and forgotten by a system designed to fail them. The prosecution's case was strong, with witness after witness detailing how Terrence had been stopped, questioned, and detained simply for existing in a space where people like him weren't supposed to be. Terrence himself took the stand, his voice cracking as he described that night, the night that had changed everything for him. I wasn't doing anything wrong, he said, his eyes not meeting the jury's gaze. I was just trying to get home. Carmen leaned forward, her grip tightening on the gavel. His words hung in the air like a heavy fog. This wasn't just another case. This was personal. Then the door creaked open. Carmen's heart sank as Officer Taylor entered, pale and tense. He made his way to the witness stand, his movements stiff, his confidence from earlier nowhere to be found. As the prosecutor began her questioning, Carmen's gaze never left him. The tension in the room was palpable as Taylor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Officer Taylor, can you describe the events leading up to the arrest of Terrence Daniels? Taylor's voice wavered. I was patrolling the area, and I saw Daniels. He looked out of place. There it was again. Out of place. Carmen's blood ran cold. It was code. Everyone in the room knew it. The prosecutor didn't let it slide. Could you clarify, Officer Taylor? What exactly about Mr. Daniels made him seem suspicious to you? Taylor hesitated, the silence stretching painfully long. Carmen's heart beat loudly in her chest. The courtroom was on the edge of its seat, waiting for the answer. What was the real reason Terrence Daniels had been stopped? What was the truth hiding behind those words, those thinly veiled justifications? Carmen watched, her heart pounding, as Officer Taylor shifted his gaze nervously from the prosecutor to the jury, and finally, to the defense table where Terrence Daniels sat. His face was a mask of stoic indifference, but Carmen could see it, the tension in his hands, clenched tightly together, betraying his outward composure. The air was thick with anticipation, every eye in the courtroom waiting, breath held. Taylor's voice cracked as he answered the prosecutor, his discomfort almost palpable. He was waiting, he stammered, his eyes flicking anxiously around, like a man preparing to flee, as if he were hiding something. But what? Was he truly suspicious, or was it something deeper? The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, her tone sharp as a blade, cutting through the uncertainty in the room. And what exactly was Mr. Daniels doing when you first saw him? Taylor swallowed hard, his face flushing as if caught in a lie. He was just standing there, like he was waiting for someone. The prosecutor's voice grew colder, more pointed. So standing and waiting is suspicious behavior now, officer? Carmen's hand tightened instinctively around the gavel. Waiting, standing, looking around. Was that enough to criminalize someone? The words echoed in her mind. This was the same excuse used time and time again to justify actions that had long gone unchallenged. Actions that criminalized Black men and women for simply existing in a space. Answer the question, Officer Taylor, the prosecutor demanded, her patience fraying. Yes, Taylor muttered, his voice a mere whisper, barely audible. I thought he was out of place. Out of place. Carmen's thoughts raced. Is that enough? She glanced at the jury. Some seemed disturbed by what they were hearing, their expressions flickering with the dawning realization of the injustice laid bare before them. Others looked more uncertain, as if the reality of the situation was too much to bear. The prosecutor didn't pause. She pressed on, relentless. During your search of Mr. Daniels, did you find anything at all, that suggested he was involved in criminal activity? Taylor hesitated again, his eyes darting nervously to the defense table. He finally admitted, his voice shaking, no, we didn't find anything. The prosecutor nodded slowly, her eyes locking with his. So, to summarize, Mr. Daniels was standing in his own neighborhood, waiting for a ride, and you arrested him because you thought he didn't belong. Is that correct, Officer Taylor? There it was. Taylor's silence, thick and suffocating, spoke volumes. The truth hung heavy in the air. No further questions, Your Honor, the prosecutor declared, her voice final. Carmen's gaze followed Taylor as he descended from the stand, his once confident posture now crumpled, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his own failure. The room held its breath, the tension suffocating. For a brief moment, Carmen allowed herself to feel the gravity of it all. It's not just Taylor. It's this system, she thought. This flawed, broken system that has perpetuated injustice for far too long. The trial continued, each side presenting their closing arguments. The defense tried to paint Taylor as a well-meaning cop, an officer who had made a simple mistake. But Carmen saw through it, as did the jury. The prosecutor, with unyielding force, made it clear. This wasn't just one man's mistake. This was the manifestation of years of unchecked racial profiling, of innocent people subjected to prejudice simply for existing. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, Carmen couldn't shake the feeling of unease that clung to her. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence, only broken by the distant murmurs of reporters preparing for the next big story. Her thoughts were a whirlwind. Had justice truly been served? Or was this just another cycle in a system too deeply entrenched in its own biases to ever change? And then, just as the weight of the moment threatened to consume her, the door creaked open. Officer Taylor stepped back in, his face ashen, his steps slow and hesitant. Carmen's breath caught in her throat as he approached the bench, but instead of returning to his seat, he made his way toward her. She couldn't help but wonder, what was he about to say? Your Honor, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, may I speak? Carmen studied him carefully. The officer who had once stood so tall, so confident, was now a shadow of himself. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke again, his words soft but heavy with regret. I made a mistake, Taylor admitted. I let my assumptions, my prejudices get the better of me. I thought I was protecting the community, but I was wrong. I see that now. The courtroom was still, utterly still, as every eye fixed on Taylor, awaiting his next words. He continued, his voice cracking. I didn't realize what I was doing at the time. But I know I hurt Mr. Daniels. I know I let my biases cloud my judgment. And for that, I'm sorry. Carmen's chest tightened. His apology, raw and heartfelt, hung in the air, but it wasn't enough. It couldn't undo the harm, couldn't erase the damage done. Taylor's words were just that, words. The kind of words that, when weighed against the reality of what had happened, didn't carry the weight of true justice. I wish I could take it back, Taylor said, his gaze dropping to the floor. I wish I could go back and make things right, but I can't. All I can do now is apologize. And try to be better. A long silence followed. Carmen watched him, the young officer now broken, his shoulders bowed under the realization of what he had done. It's not enough, Carmen thought again. It will never be enough unless real change comes with it. Finally, Carmen spoke, her voice steady yet firm. Your apology is noted, Officer Taylor, but understand this. The harm caused by actions like yours runs deep. It doesn't just affect one man. It affects entire communities. Taylor nodded silently, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the ground. It's not enough to be sorry, Carmen continued, her gaze unwavering. Real change requires more than that. It requires accountability. It requires action. I understand, Taylor whispered. Carmen dismissed him with a quiet nod, her thoughts already turning to the next steps. The jury's return, the final verdict. But the reality was clear. Justice, in this case, was far from a simple victory. It was just another step in a long, exhausting battle. When the jury returned, their expressions solemn, Carmen could feel the anticipation in the air. The verdict was read aloud. We find the defendant guilty of wrongful arrest and racial discrimination. Carmen's eyes moved to Terrence Daniels, his face frozen in disbelief, the weight of the decision finally sinking in. Across the room, Officer Taylor stood motionless, his fists clenched at his sides, the full force of the verdict bearing down on him. For a moment, Carmen thought he might collapse, but he held himself upright, staring blankly at the floor. With a decisive bang of her gavel, Carmen called for the court to adjourn. The room erupted into chaos. Reporters scrambled, eager to capture the moment. Terrence's family rushed to his side, offering comfort as tears welled in his eyes. As Carmen watched Taylor slowly exit the courtroom, his head hung low. She couldn't shake the feeling that, while justice had been served today, it was far from the end of the fight. She remained seated, her mind heavy with the knowledge that this was just one case in an endless cycle of injustice. The battle for justice was far from over. The door creaked open once more, and Carmen's attention shifted to Sergeant Isaac Harris, the older officer who had intervened earlier. His face, lined with exhaustion, spoke volumes, but there was something else in his expression, quiet determination. "Judge Banks," he said softly, "may I have a word?" Carmen gestured for him to sit. As he spoke, Harris thanked her for handling the case with such integrity. "You held us accountable, and that's exactly what we need." Carmen sighed, her mind heavy with the responsibility of it all. "It doesn't feel like enough," she replied. "This is just one case. There are so many more out there. So many who don't get justice." Harris nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. But that's why we have to keep pushing. This case may not change everything, but it's a step forward. Every step forward matters." Carmen met his gaze, seeing the same weary resolve she felt reflected in his eyes. They had been through so much, but Harris still believed in change. And that in itself gave her a small comfort. As Harris rose to leave, he offered a quiet, respectful nod. "You keep doing what you're doing, Judge. That's how we change things. Piece by piece." Carmen watched him walk toward the door, his steps slow but purposeful. The courtroom was empty now, but the fight for justice, the fight for change, would never be. It was just one step forward, but it mattered. The long, arduous journey felt endless, yet today was a step forward. Carmen couldn't help but think, is this how change begins? She clung to that thought, trying to soothe the whirlwind inside her. The next morning, the courthouse hummed with anticipation, the air charged with an electric energy. The jury had reached its decision, and news outlets from all over the country hovered, waiting for the final word. Inside her chambers, Carmen sat alone, her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup as she stared at the case files scattered before her. The room was cloaked in a silence broken only by the distant buzz of activity. This case, felt like a turning point, like the world was holding its breath, and Carmen felt the weight of it, heavy and undeniable. Outside, the crowd had gathered once again, their voices rising in protest or hope, fueling the fire that had burned through this entire trial. The courthouse felt like a pressure cooker, and Carmen, ever the steady presence, could feel the suffocating pressure pushing in from all sides. This isn't just a local story anymore, she thought. This is bigger. This is a symbol. The trial of Terrence Daniels had become a national stage in the fight against racial injustice, and all eyes were now on her courtroom. Her mind drifted back to the previous day. Officer Taylor's apology still echoed in her thoughts. She had heard his words, each one sincere, but were they enough? No, they couldn't undo the harm he'd caused. His apology wasn't a magic fix, nor was it enough to erase the deep-rooted biases that had led to Terrence's wrongful arrest. That was the real issue. Taylor wasn't an anomaly. He wasn't a rogue cop. He was a product of a broken system, and Carmen had dedicated her life to challenging it. A knock at the door brought her back to the present. Her clerk Emily entered, a slim folder in her hands. The tension in the young woman's eyes was palpable. This is it, Carmen thought. The moment we've all been waiting for. The jury's ready, Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. Carmen nodded, rising from her seat, smoothing down her robe. Let's do this, she thought, pushing aside the growing tide of emotion. As she made her way down the hall toward the courtroom, the usual bustle of the courthouse had turned into an oppressive stillness, as if the entire building were holding its breath. The anticipation was thick in the air, and Carmen could feel it, pressing in, suffocating in its intensity. But she couldn't let it consume her. Not today. Today was about one thing: delivering justice. When she entered the courtroom, the atmosphere was stifling. The gallery was packed, reporters perched in every corner, cameras ready to snap the pivotal moment. The families of both Terrence Daniels and Officer Taylor sat in the front rows, their faces a mix of anxiety, hope, and fear. Carmen took her place at the bench, her eyes scanning the room, letting the gravity of the moment settle into her bones. Her gaze landed on Terrence. There he sat, calm, his hands folded, his face a mask of exhaustion and hope. He had been through so much, yet in his eyes, there was still a flicker of something. Hope that today at last justice might be served. Across from him, Officer Taylor sat, looking smaller than he had the day before. His eyes darted nervously, his hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the table. For the first time, he seemed to realize the weight of what was happening, that he couldn't outrun the consequences of his actions. Please bring in the jury. Carmen's voice rang out, clear and steady despite the storm inside her. The doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and the jurors filed in, each one taking their seat as Carmen's heart pounded in her chest. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with dark hair pulled tight into a bun, rose from her seat, clutching a slip of paper in her hand, her fingers trembling. Carmen's eyes narrowed, sensing the significance of this moment. Has the jury reached a verdict? She asked, her voice steady. The foreman nodded, her voice quivering ever so slightly. We have, Your Honor. Please read the verdict, Carmen instructed, her hands steady despite the torrent of emotions swirling beneath the surface. The foreman glanced down at the paper, then back up at the courtroom. Her voice was firm as she read the words that would forever alter the course of this trial. In the case of Officer Michael Taylor, we find the defendant guilty of wrongful arrest and racial discrimination. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, but it was quickly silenced by the sheer weight of the verdict. Carmen's gaze flicked to Terrence, his face frozen in shock, his eyes wide with disbelief. Slowly, the realization hit him. It happened. They found him guilty. A tear slid down his cheek, and his lawyer placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. Finally, Terrence allowed himself to exhale, the first breath of relief he'd taken in a long time. Across the room, Officer Taylor stood motionless, his face drained of color. His hands clenched the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The weight of the verdict was sinking in. He had been found guilty. There was no escaping it now. Carmen banged her gavel, her voice cutting through the stillness. Court is adjourned. As the courtroom emptied, the reporters rushing to file their stories, Carmen remained seated at the bench, her mind spinning. The trial had ended, but the work was far from over. This case, this verdict, was just one small piece of a much larger puzzle. The fight for justice stretched far beyond the walls of this courtroom. The room was nearly empty now, save for a few stragglers, the families of Terrence and Officer Taylor, the attorneys quietly gathering their papers. Carmen stayed seated, the weight of the gavel still heavy in her hands. She had seen countless cases in her career, but this one left a mark on her. More than the complexities of the law, more than the intricacies of the defense and prosecution. It represented something deeper, a fight for dignity in a system that had long forgotten its promises. Slowly she stood, her legs weary from the weight of the trial. She glanced toward the back of the courtroom, where Terrence sat with his lawyer, surrounded by his family. Their quiet murmurs filled with exhaustion and relief. Terrence met her gaze for a fleeting moment, and Carmen gave him a small, reassuring nod. Words weren't necessary. What had happened in that room today was a small victory, but one that carried enormous weight. As she gathered her notes, preparing to leave, she caught sight of Officer Taylor by the exit. His uniform seemed too large for him now, as if the trial had shrunk him, both physically and emotionally. He leaned against the wall, pale, his eyes downcast. Carmen felt a pang of empathy. She knew his remorse, however genuine, couldn't undo the damage done. She walked past him, intending to leave without a word, but something in the way he looked at her, so full of regret, so confused, made her pause. Judge Banks, he whispered, his voice hoarse. Carmen turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Yes. Taylor straightened, his eyes locking onto hers, but neither spoke. The silence between them was thick, pregnant with unspoken words. Taylor's voice faltered, his hands fidgeting at his sides. I didn't expect to see you here. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Carmen's face remained impassive, but her mind raced. She'd heard it all before. The apologies from those who caused harm, claiming it was never intentional. I didn't mean for it to happen, they always said. But it did, Carmen thought bitterly. It did happen, Officer Taylor. It keeps happening. You didn't mean for it to happen, Carmen repeated, her voice cold. But it did. To people like Terrence. To people like me. And now you're standing here, apologizing after the damage is already done. Taylor flushed, guilt flooding his face. I know. I screwed up. I let my biases get in the way. But it's not as simple as just undoing everything I've been taught. Carmen crossed her arms, narrowing her eyes. What changed for you now? She wondered. Is it because you got caught? Or because someone finally held you accountable? I see it now, Taylor admitted, his voice quiet. But I didn't before. I thought I was doing my job, protecting the community. But I was wrong. I see that now. Carmen took a deep breath, softening just slightly. She had spent years walking the fine line between understanding and accountability. But today she was tired. Tired of apologies that couldn't undo the damage. Tired of a system that was so broken, it couldn't see the harm it caused. Officer Taylor, she began, her voice measured. What you did goes beyond a mistake. It's part of a much larger problem. And while I appreciate that you've come to realize your biases, I hope you understand. It's going to take more than an apology to make things right. Taylor nodded, his face full of regret. I know. I'm going to do better. I'm going to learn from this. Carmen studied him for a long moment. She had seen many people come to these realizations too late, after the harm had already been done. But there was something in Taylor's demeanor now, a glimmer of sincerity. Whether that would lead to true change, only time would tell. I hope you do, Carmen said softly but firmly. Because it's people like you, people in positions of authority, who have the power to either perpetuate this problem or help dismantle it. Taylor nodded, his eyes filled with determination. I'll keep that in mind. Carmen gave him one last look, then turned toward the exit. As she stepped outside, the humid Louisiana air hit her. But it was the weight of the conversation that lingered. The fight isn't over, she thought. This is just the beginning. The media was already swarming the front entrance, cameras ready to capture the aftermath. But Carmen knew there would be no simple answers for the questions they would ask. No easy way to sum up what had happened here today. She opted for the side exit, hoping to avoid the crush of reporters. As she walked down the side steps, her mind drifted back to Terrence Daniels, the young man whose life had been upended by a simple walk home, and to all the other men and women like him, who had faced the same injustices. This wasn't the end of the story, not by a long shot. This was just the beginning of a much larger conversation, one that needed to happen in courtrooms, police stations, and communities all across the country. Just as she neared her car, she heard someone call her name. Turning, she saw Terrence walking toward her, his attorney a few steps behind. His face was calm now, though the exhaustion of the past few days still lingered in his eyes. Judge Banks, he said, his voice steady. I just wanted to thank you for everything. Carmen looked at him, her heart heavy with the weight of what he had endured. You don't need to thank me, she thought. This fight belongs to all of us. Terrence's voice was calm, but the weight of his words struck Carmen hard. I was just doing my job, he said, shaking his head, dismissing her attempt to simplify the situation. No, it's more than that, he continued, his voice laced with an urgency that made Carmen's heart race. This trial, this moment, wasn't just about him. It was bigger than that. He was right. It was about showing the world what really happens, about revealing the truth they try so desperately to hide. Tension coiled in Carmen's chest as his words settled deep within her. She nodded, understanding what he meant in a way that was almost painful. I hope this is a step toward change, she said carefully, her voice carrying the weight of her own uncertainty. But it's just one case. We still have a long way to go. Terrence's eyes softened then, a small but sincere smile tugging at the corner of his lips. I know, he said, his voice warm, almost reassuring. But it's a start. And for that I'm grateful. As he walked away, his attorney following closely behind, Carmen stood there for a moment, watching him disappear into the crowd. A start. But was it enough? One trial, one verdict, one small victory in a sea of injustices that stretched far beyond the walls of the courtroom. It wasn't enough to dismantle a system built on centuries of bias and inequality. The weight of it all threatened to pull her under, but she steadied herself. Terrence was right, it was a start. Unlocking her car, Carmen slid into the driver's seat, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. The road ahead was long, and the fight for justice, true justice, would continue, both in and out of the courtroom. But today at least they had taken a step forward. The city stretched out before her as she drove, the streets twisting and turning like a maze, each one a reflection of the invisible lines that divided people, race, class, history. How much longer would this fight last? She could feel the weight of the battle pressing on her shoulders, but she knew deep down it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Tomorrow, she reminded herself, the work would begin again. But for now, she let herself breathe, just for a moment. A moment of peace in the chaos. She needed it. As the courthouse faded in her rearview mirror, her mind wandered to the other judges, lawyers, and officers across the country, all grappling with the same questions she had faced today. How could they rebuild a system that had been flawed from the start? How could they ensure justice was more than just a word, a reality, for everyone, not just the privileged few? The answers wouldn't come easily, and they certainly wouldn't come quickly. But Carmen knew that today had been a step forward, and sometimes that was all they could hope for. She drove in silence, the hum of the city outside blending into the rhythm of her thoughts. The streets of Baton Rouge blurred past her, but her mind remained firmly anchored in the courtroom. The faces she had encountered, the names she had heard, Terrence, Officer Taylor, Sergeant Harris. They were all a part of the same story, one rooted in a history far older than any of them. When Carmen reached her driveway, she sat for a moment, the quiet stillness of her car wrapping around her like a blanket. The day had taken its toll. Exhaustion crept through her, both physically and emotionally, like an unwelcome visitor. But it wasn't just the physical fatigue that weighed on her. It was the toll of confronting injustice day after day, feeling its oppressive weight pressing in from every angle. She stepped out of the car and paused, looking up at the sky. It was dusk, the last rays of sunlight fading into the horizon. For the first time all day, she felt a rare moment of peace. She inhaled deeply, allowing the tension in her shoulders to melt away, even if only for a few minutes. Inside her home, Carmen hung up her coat and slipped off her heels, feeling the coolness of the floor beneath her feet, a small comfort. She moved through the house on autopilot, her mind replaying the events of the day. The conversation with Officer Taylor lingered, his words echoing in her mind. I didn't mean for this to happen. It was a simple statement, yet it struck her deeply, not because it was unusual, but because it was so common. She had heard it time and again, from defendants, from police officers, from people whose actions had caused harm, but who hadn't fully grasped the weight of their choices until it was too late. And yet the harm had already been done. Intentions didn't matter when lives were ruined. Her thoughts shifted to Terrence, still fresh in her mind. She could see the relief in his eyes, the way his shoulders had relaxed when the verdict was read. Today was a victory for him, but Carmen knew this battle was far from over. His case had made it to court, but how many others had been swept under the rug? How many stories had been silenced before they ever had the chance to be told? These were the questions that haunted her. These were the questions that kept her up long after the gavel had fallen and the courtroom had emptied. The next morning, the weight on Carmen's chest remained. The soft light of dawn filtered through her bedroom window, casting a pale glow over the room. She lay there for a moment, her mind already racing with the day ahead. More cases, more people seeking justice, more barriers standing in their way. She sighed, rolling out of bed, knowing that the fight would continue whether she was ready or not. Carmen's morning routine was quick, efficient. A cup of coffee, a glance at the headlines, and a brief moment of stillness before slipping into her professional armor. The black robe, the calm expression, the steady hands. It was a role she had perfected, but one that never felt truly comfortable. Beneath the surface, the delicate balance she maintained between empathy and impartiality, between justice and mercy, was always present. When she arrived at the courthouse later that morning, Carmen felt the familiar rush of activity around her. Lawyers, clerks, officers, they moved with purpose, their footsteps echoing in the marble halls. She nodded at a few familiar faces as she made her way to her chambers, her mind already turning over the cases ahead. But just as she settled into the rhythm of the day, a knock on her door broke her concentration. It was Emily, her clerk, holding a stack of papers and wearing a frown. "Judge Banks, you might want to see this," Emily said, her tone serious. Carmen's brow furrowed as she looked up. "What now?" Emily handed her a thin folder. Carmen opened it, her stomach sinking as she quickly scanned the contents. It was a report, an internal review of Officer Taylor's conduct within the police department, focusing on his treatment of Black and minority residents. And the findings weren't good. It wasn't the first time Taylor had been involved in a controversial incident like the one with Terrence. The report outlined multiple complaints against him: racial profiling, unjustified stops, escalating confrontations. And yet, despite all of this, Taylor remained on the force. Carmen's frustration bubbled to the surface, but she forced herself to stay calm. This was the very system she had been working within for years, a system that allowed officers like Taylor to act with impunity, protected by layers of bureaucracy and unspoken biases. The verdict in Terrence's case had been a small victory, but it was clear this battle was far from over. Carmen closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "Thanks for bringing this to my attention." Emily nodded, clearly understanding the gravity of the situation. "What are you going to do about it?" Carmen let out a slow breath, her mind already working through the possibilities. "I'm going to do what I always do. Keep pushing for change. Case by case. But this needs more attention." Emily nodded again, clearly grasping the weight of the situation. "If you need anything, just let me know," she said, before leaving the room. Carmen sat in the silence that followed, her thoughts swirling. This wasn't just about Officer Taylor anymore. It was about a system that allowed people like him to operate unchecked. A culture that excused bad behavior, as long as it didn't make too much noise. And Carmen knew it was time to make some noise. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she knew well. After a few rings, Sergeant Harris answered. "Sergeant Harris, it's Judge Banks. I think we need to have a conversation." Later that day, they sat together in a quiet corner of a local cafe, the hum of conversation fading into the background as they spoke. "You've seen the report on Taylor?" Carmen asked, her eyes locked on Harris. Harris nodded, his face lined with concern. "I've seen it. It's not good." "No, it's not," Carmen agreed, her frustration barely contained. "And yet he's still on the force. How is that possible?" Harris sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "It's the system, Judge. It's broken. Complaints get buried. Investigations get delayed. And by the time anyone realizes there's a problem, it's too late. Officers like Taylor get protected because no one wants to admit there's a deeper issue." Carmen's anger surged. "That's not acceptable, Sergeant. We can't keep allowing this to happen. People are getting hurt. Lives are being destroyed." Harris nodded, his expression grim. "I know. I'm trying to change things from the inside, but it's not easy. The culture runs deep, and it's going to take." Carmen's heart raced, her mind swirling with the gravity of what lay ahead. The words she had just spoken echoed in her ears. "We need to bring this to light." As she sat across from Sergeant Harris, the weight of the conversation pressed down on her, unyielding. It wasn't just Officer Taylor. No, this was much bigger. It was the entire system that allowed officers like him to act without consequence. She had always known the justice system was flawed, but the deeper she dug, the clearer it became. These flaws ran deeper than she could have ever imagined. "I understand that going public with this will stir up trouble," Carmen said, her voice steady yet fierce. But maybe that's exactly what we need. If the system's broken, then it's time we stop pretending it isn't. Harris met her gaze, his eyes heavy with a mix of respect and concern. You're right, Judge. But you need to understand something. Going public won't be easy. You'll face resistance, from inside the department, from the public. People don't want to believe the problem is this widespread. Carmen didn't flinch. She leaned forward, her eyes burning with resolve. If we don't speak up, nothing will change, she said, her voice quiet, but filled with a quiet urgency. We owe it to people like Terrence to try. Harris let out a long sigh, his hand rubbing across his jaw torn. I've been in this business for over 30 years, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. I've seen it all, the good, the bad. I've watched officers come in bright-eyed, hopeful, only to watch them get crushed by a system they thought they could fix. Don't think one case will change everything overnight, Carmen. Carmen nodded, absorbing his words. She didn't expect miracles. She didn't expect everything to change in a single move. But she expected progress. And progress, she knew, had to start somewhere. I don't expect miracles, Sergeant. But if we don't start bringing things like this to light, we're just letting it continue in the shadows. Harris studied her for a moment, then softened, his expression changing. I'll stand with you, Carmen, he said quietly. I've been trying to change things from the inside for years. And if going public with this will move the needle, even just a little, then I'll help you however I can. A spark of hope ignited in Carmen's chest. It wasn't a solution, not yet, but it was a start. Thank you, Harris, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We need more people like you. People willing to stand up and call out the problem, even when it's hard. He nodded, but the sadness in his eyes didn't fade. Just be ready, Judge. This won't be pretty. It won't be easy. A faint smile tugged at Carmen's lips. Nothing worth fighting forever is, she said, her voice steady. As they wrapped up their conversation, Carmen stood and walked out of the cafe. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement, but her mind was racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. The trial had been a victory, yes, but it was just one small piece in a much larger puzzle. If they were going to fix the system, they needed to do more than win individual cases. They needed to dismantle the very structures that allowed these injustices to happen in the first place. That evening, Carmen sat in her living room, the low hum of the television providing a faint background noise. The news was filled with coverage of the trial, reporters dissecting every moment, every word spoken in the courtroom. But what struck Carmen most wasn't the analysis. It was the way people were talking about the case, as if it were an isolated incident. A singular story of injustice in an otherwise functional system. She turned the volume down, her mind racing. How could they not see it? How could they not understand that this case wasn't the exception? It was the rule. Terrence's story wasn't unique. It was one of thousands, maybe millions, that had been pushed aside, ignored, dismissed because it didn't fit the narrative people wanted to believe. Her hand reached for her phone, and after a brief hesitation, she dialed a number she hadn't used in some time. Carmen. The voice on the other end was familiar but surprised. Hey, Maya, Carmen said, her voice soft but firm. I think we need to talk. Maya Williams, a sharp, focused investigative journalist and an old friend from law school, had always been someone Carmen admired. Maya had the courage to dig into the stories others were too afraid to touch, to uncover the truth buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and corruption. If anyone could help Carmen bring the truth about systemic issues in law enforcement to light, it was Maya. They agreed to meet the following day. Carmen spent the night preparing, knowing once they started this journey, there would be no turning back. But deep down, she also knew it was the right thing to do. The next afternoon, Carmen sat across from Maya in a quiet coffee shop tucked away in downtown Baton Rouge. Maya looked just as Carmen remembered, sharp-eyed, her no-nonsense attitude radiating from her as she leaned forward. So Carmen, Maya began, narrowing her eyes slightly. What's going on? You sounded serious on the phone. Carmen took a deep breath. She knew this was going to be tough, but she had no choice but to speak the truth. She explained everything. The trial, Officer Taylor, and most importantly the internal report she had uncovered. As she spoke, She saw Maya's expression shift from curiosity to disbelief, and finally to a quiet, simmering fury. "You're telling me this isn't the first time Taylor's done this?" Maya asked, her voice low and tense. Carmen nodded. "There are multiple complaints buried, ignored. And it's not just him. This is happening all over the country. But people don't want to see it. They don't want to believe the system is broken." Maya leaned back in her chair, her eyes scanning the room as she processed the magnitude of what Carmen had just revealed. "This is big," she said, finally breaking the silence. "We've all known about racial profiling and police misconduct, but to have proof, actual proof, that the department is actively ignoring it? That's huge. That's why I came to you," Carmen said, her voice steady. "I need someone who can tell this story. Someone who can make people pay attention." Maya nodded, her mind clearly racing with possibilities. "I can do that. But you need to understand something, Carmen. Once we start digging into this, there's no going back. The department, the unions, they'll come after you. They'll come after me." Carmen met her gaze, her resolve unshaken. "I know. But if we don't do this, nothing will change." Maya smiled faintly, the fire of determination flashing in her eyes. "Then let's do it. I'll start looking into Taylor's history. See if I can find more complaints that were swept under the rug. I'll dig into the department's internal records. See what else they've been hiding." Carmen nodded, a feeling of relief settling in her chest. "Thank you, Maya. I knew I could count on you." "You know me," Maya grinned. "I can't resist a good fight." As they parted ways, Carmen felt a sense of purpose like she hadn't felt in years. The road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready for it. She had spent too many years fighting for justice within the courtroom, and now, it was time to take that fight beyond those walls. Over the next few weeks, Carmen and Maya worked tirelessly to uncover the full extent of the problem. Maya's investigation uncovered even more troubling details. Officers with long histories of misconduct, complaints buried or ignored, and a department more interested in protecting its own than in holding people accountable. Then one morning it happened. Maya's article appeared on the front page of every major newspaper. The headline was simple but devastating: "Systemic Bias. How Baton Rouge Police Ignored Warnings and Allowed Misconduct to Flourish." The article laid everything bare. The complaints, the cover-ups, the internal reports quietly filed away to avoid scrutiny. It named names, exposed patterns of abuse, and called for immediate reform. The public outcry was swift, furious. People were shocked, angry, demanding answers. Protests erupted outside courthouses and police stations, with citizens calling for accountability and transparency. The department tried to contain the damage, but it was too late. The story had taken on a life of its own. Carmen watched the news unfold from her chambers, her phone buzzing with messages, some of support, others of anger. She had expected this. She had known the backlash would come, but she also knew it was worth it. This was the disruption the system needed to force change. As the days passed, more officers came forward, sharing their stories of misconduct, of being pressured to stay silent. Investigations were opened. High-ranking officials were placed under scrutiny. The momentum was building, and for the first time in a long time, Carmen felt a glimmer of hope. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick. But for the first time, real change seemed possible. One evening, Carmen stood on the steps of the courthouse, looking out at the crowd below. People were holding signs chanting for justice, for reform. It was a powerful sight, one that filled her with purpose. The fight was far from over. The system was deeply flawed, and it would take years, maybe decades, to fix it. But today they had taken a step forward. And sometimes that was all it took to spark a movement. As the sun set behind her, Carmen smiled to herself. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, she felt they were heading in the right direction. And that, she thought, was enough.